As long as she gives us the baby, everything will be fine. Those were the words that shattered 8 years of marriage in less than 5 seconds. I was not supposed to hear them. Even now, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had arrived at the clinic on time instead of 20 minutes early. Maybe I would have walked into my appointment smiling. Maybe I would have continued believing my life was exactly what it seemed. Instead, I found myself standing motionless outside a partially open consultation room door while my husband Ethan and my mother-in-law Margaret discussed my future as though I were not even a person. The fertility clinic occupied the 4th floor of a modern medical building in downtown Chicago. The waiting area was quiet except for the distant hum of air conditioning and the occasional sound of nurses moving through the hallway. I had parked in the garage across the street and hurried inside because traffic had been lighter than usual. As I approached the reception desk, I noticed familiar voices coming from a nearby office. At first I smiled. I assumed Ethan and Margaret had arrived before me. Then I heard Margaret speak. She does not suspect anything. I stopped walking. My hand tightened around the strap of my purse. Ethan answered so quietly that I almost missed it. She trusts us. Margaret sighed. Good. As long as she gives us the baby, everything will be fine. The world seemed to tilt beneath me. For a moment, I genuinely believed I had misunderstood what they were saying. My first instinct was to walk into the room and laugh about the strange misunderstanding. But something inside me told me to stay where I was. Then I heard my own name. Olivia has always wanted a family, Margaret said. That made everything easier. I felt a cold sensation spread through my chest. Easier for what? My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the rest of the conversation. I stepped closer to the doorway. Through the narrow opening, I could see Margaret seated beside Ethan at a conference table. Several folders lay open in front of them. Neither looked upset. Neither looked guilty. They looked organized, prepared, as though they were discussing a business plan. Ethan rubbed his forehead. I still did not like talking about it this way. Margaret leaned forward. What matters is protecting the Carter family. Protecting the Carter family. The phrase echoed in my mind. I had heard it before. At holiday dinners. At birthdays. At family gatherings. Margaret always spoke about legacy and family history as though they were sacred responsibilities. Suddenly those conversations felt different. Dangerous even. A nurse appeared at the end of the hallway, and I quickly stepped away from the door. I pretended to check messages on my phone until she disappeared around a corner. When I looked back toward the office, Ethan and Margaret were gone. The door remained slightly open. I should have left. I should have gone straight home. Instead, I walked into the room. The folders had been removed, but one file remained on the table. A thick cream-colored folder with a printed label across the front. My breath caught instantly. Written in black letters was my full name. Olivia Carter. Beneath it was a date from 3 years before I had even met Ethan. For several seconds, I could only stare at the date printed beneath my name. 3 years before I had ever met Ethan. 3 years before our first dinner. 3 years before our first date. My fingers tightened around the edge of the folder as 1,000 questions raced through my mind. Why would a fertility clinic have a file on me years before I became part of the Carter family? I glanced toward the hallway. The office remained empty. Every instinct told me to put the folder down and walk away. Instead, I opened it. The first page contained basic information about me. My full name, my age, my occupation at the time, my medical history. None of that surprised me. The next page did. Someone had highlighted specific notes from an annual physical examination I had completed years earlier. Several sections were marked with yellow tabs. I flipped through more pages. There were summaries of public records, social media screenshots, and even details about volunteer organizations I had joined in my 20s. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. It felt less like a medical file and more like a research project. A project centered entirely on me. My heart pounded harder with every page. Then I saw a signature. Margaret Carter. I froze. Her name appeared at the bottom of a consultation document dated nearly 18 months before Ethan first introduced himself to me. I reread the date 3 times to make sure I was not mistaken. There it was. Clear and undeniable. Margaret had been involved long before I entered their lives. Suddenly, dozens of memories returned to me. The first time Ethan approached me at a charity fundraiser. The strange coincidence that we seemed to share so many mutual connections. The way Margaret welcomed me almost immediately, as though she already knew everything about me. Back then, I had considered myself lucky. Now those memories felt different. Carefully planned. Deliberate. I continued turning pages until a folded sheet slipped from the folder and landed on the table. I picked it up. It appeared to be a profile summary. Height, education, career stability, family background, community involvement. Under a section labeled long-term suitability, someone had typed a sentence that made my stomach drop. Exceptional candidate for future family planning objectives. Candidate, not person, not future daughter-in-law. Candidate. The word felt cold and clinical. I suddenly heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. Panic surged through me. I shoved the papers back into the folder and closed it just as voices echoed nearby. A moment later, I slipped out of the office and returned to the waiting area. Ethan appeared a few seconds later with his usual easy smile. "There you are," he said. "I was wondering where you went." I studied his face carefully. For years that smile had made me feel safe. Now I found myself searching for signs of deception. "I was just looking around," I replied. He nodded and sat beside me. Margaret joined us moments later. She reached over and squeezed my hand affectionately. "Everything is going to work out exactly as planned," she said warmly. The comment seemed harmless. Maybe it would have sounded harmless a few hours earlier. But now it sent a chill through me. As the receptionist called my name, I forced myself to stand. Then I noticed something tucked inside Margaret's leather portfolio. It was another document bearing my name. Across the top was a title I had never seen before. Family Succession Agreement. For the rest of the appointment, I barely heard a word Dr. Rebecca Hayes said. I nodded when appropriate and answered questions automatically, but my mind remained fixed on the document I had seen inside Margaret's portfolio. Family Succession Agreement. The phrase sounded less like something created for a family and more like something drafted for a corporation. By the time Ethan drove us home, I had already decided I needed answers before confronting anyone. If I accused them too early, they would simply deny everything. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table pretending to answer work emails while Ethan watched television in the living room. Every few minutes, I glanced toward him. He seemed completely relaxed. He laughed at a commercial. He discussed weekend plans. He asked whether I wanted takeout for dinner. Looking at him, it was almost impossible to believe he had been part of the conversation I overheard earlier that day. Yet every time I started doubting myself, I remembered the file, the dates, the signatures, the word candidate. Around 10 o'clock, Ethan went upstairs to shower. The moment I heard the bathroom door close, I opened my laptop and began searching through old emails. At first, I did not know exactly what I was looking for. Then I remembered something Margaret had said years ago. She claimed she first heard about me through a mutual acquaintance. Back then, I never questioned it. Now I wanted proof. I searched through archived messages from nearly a decade earlier. Hundreds of emails appeared. Most were completely ordinary. Then I found one that made my pulse quicken. It had arrived 6 months before Ethan first introduced himself to me. The sender's name was unfamiliar, but the message referenced a charity fundraiser I attended regularly. Attached was a guest list. My name had been highlighted. I opened additional emails. Another contained notes about community volunteers. Again, my name appeared. Another mentioned professional networking events. Again, my name appeared. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Someone had been tracking my movements long before I became part of the Carter family. My hands trembled as I continued searching. Shortly after midnight, I discovered an old folder buried deep within my archived account. The folder contained messages I did not remember receiving. Most had been automatically filtered years ago. One subject line immediately caught my attention. Introduction strategy. I opened the message. My stomach tightened. The email discussed arranging what appeared to be a chance meeting between two people. One of those people was Ethan. The other was me. Several names were copied on the thread. One belonged to Margaret. I stared at the screen in disbelief. The first meeting that changed my life had not been an accident. It had been organized, planned, designed. Then I scrolled farther down the conversation and found an attachment. It was a draft document. Across the top, in bold letters, was the exact title I had seen earlier at the clinic. Family Succession Agreement. And beneath the title was a sentence that made my blood run cold. Phase 1 completed successfully. I did not sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words Phase 1 completed successfully. Not a relationship. Not a marriage. A phase. As though my entire life had been reduced to a project timeline. By sunrise, I had made another decision. I needed to know how much of this plan still existed. Over the next 2 days, I acted exactly as I always had. I smiled during breakfast. I answered Ethan's texts. I attended a family dinner at Margaret's house and pretended nothing had changed. Meanwhile, I watched. I listened. For the first time in years, I noticed details that had previously seemed harmless. Margaret constantly guided conversations toward family legacy. Ethan rarely disagreed with her. Whenever discussions became personal, they somehow returned to the future of the Carter family. On Thursday afternoon, an unexpected opportunity arrived. Margaret called and asked whether I could stop by her house to help organize paperwork for an upcoming charity event. Normally, I would have agreed without hesitation. This time I accepted for a different reason. An hour later, I found myself sitting in Margaret's home office while she stepped out to take a phone call. The moment the door closed behind her, my attention shifted to a large filing cabinet beside the desk. I told myself I was being paranoid. Then I remembered the clinic file, the emails, the agreement. My hesitation disappeared. The cabinet was unlocked. Inside were neatly organized folders labeled by year. I quickly scanned the contents until one folder caught my eye. It contained my name. My hands immediately began to shake. I opened it and found copies of documents I had already seen, along with dozens I had not. There were notes from meetings, timelines, progress updates, correspondence between various professionals. Most disturbing of all were emails exchanged between Margaret and Ethan. The language felt cold and strategic. One message described my first meeting with Ethan as highly successful. Another referred to maintaining long-term alignment with family objectives. Then I found the document that truly changed everything. It was a printed email chain from 7 years earlier. Margaret had written a message to several recipients discussing potential candidates. Attached was a list of women, their ages, careers, educational backgrounds, family histories. My name appeared at the top. Beside it was a handwritten note in Margaret's unmistakable script. Ideal profile, strong values, excellent long-term fit. I stared at the page in disbelief. It felt impossible. Yet there it was in black and white. Then I heard footsteps approaching the office. Panic surged through me. I shoved the papers back into the folder and returned everything as quickly as possible. Just before closing the cabinet, one final envelope slipped onto the floor. A photograph slid halfway out. I picked it up instinctively. The image showed Ethan sitting beside Margaret and a man I did not recognize. Across the bottom, someone had written a date from 8 years earlier. It was taken 6 months before Ethan and I ever met. On the back was a single sentence. Phase 2 begins after marriage. The photograph stayed in my mind long after I left Margaret's house. Phase 2 begins after marriage. The sentence felt impossible to ignore. Whoever had created this plan had divided my life into stages years before I even knew the Carter family existed. That night, I waited until Ethan was asleep before taking another look at the photographs I had secretly captured with my phone. I enlarged every image and studied every detail. The man sitting beside Margaret and Ethan was unfamiliar at first, but something about his face seemed strangely recognizable. After nearly an hour of searching online, I finally found him. His name was Thomas Reed. He was a respected attorney who specialized in family trusts, estate planning, and generational wealth management. The discovery immediately raised another question. Why would a family attorney be discussing phases of a personal relationship months before that relationship even began? The next morning, I called his office. I did not identify myself. Instead, I asked whether he had worked with the Carter family. The receptionist answered without hesitation. For many years, she said. My pulse quickened. Later that afternoon, I scheduled a consultation under the pretense of reviewing inheritance planning. 2 days later, I found myself sitting across from Thomas Reed in a quiet conference room overlooking downtown Chicago. He appeared calm and professional, exactly the kind of attorney wealthy families trusted with sensitive matters. For several minutes, we discussed routine legal topics. Then I placed a copy of the photograph on the table. The change in his expression was immediate. He stopped speaking. His eyes settled on the image before slowly lifting toward me. "Where did you get this?" he asked. It was the same question everyone seemed to ask whenever I moved closer to the truth. "I think you already know why I am here," I replied. Thomas remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "Olivia, some decisions made years ago cannot be undone." Hearing my name startled me. I had never introduced myself. The realization sent a chill through my body. He knew exactly who I was. "What decisions?" I asked. Thomas looked toward the window before answering. The Carter family became obsessed with preserving their future. They convinced themselves they were protecting something important. My heart pounded. Protecting what? He hesitated. Their legacy. The word sounded familiar. I had heard Margaret use it countless times. Thomas opened a folder on his desk and removed a single sheet of paper. He stared at it for a moment before sliding it toward me. Across the top appeared the title I had come to hate. Family Succession Agreement. This version contained several pages I had never seen before. Most of the text was heavily redacted, but one section remained visible. I read the sentence once, then again, then a third time. According to the document, Phase 3 was scheduled to begin immediately after a successful pregnancy. And beside that section was a handwritten approval signed by both Ethan Carter and Margaret Carter. For several moments I could not look away from the signatures. Ethan Carter, Margaret Carter. Both names sat beneath a section outlining a future I had never agreed to. My hands felt numb as I stared at the page. Thomas Reed remained silent across the table, allowing the reality to settle in. Finally I looked up. Did Ethan know about all of this? I asked. Thomas hesitated. That hesitation told me more than any answer could have. At various points, yes, he said carefully. How much he understood is a different question. I folded the document and placed it back on the table. My heart felt heavy, but beneath the shock something else had begun to grow. Determination. For days I had been collecting fragments. Files, emails, notes, signatures. Now a pattern was emerging. Someone had designed a future for me without my knowledge. Someone had decided what role I would play. And according to this agreement, that role had very little to do with who I actually was. That evening, Ethan arrived home carrying takeout from my favorite restaurant. Normally, the gesture would have made me smile. Instead, I found myself wondering how many of our shared memories were genuine and how many had been influenced by the plan I kept uncovering. During dinner, I studied him carefully. He spoke about work, weekend plans, a baseball game he wanted to watch. Everything sounded normal. Yet every time he smiled, I remembered his signature beneath Phase 3. After dinner, I finally asked a question. Do you ever feel like your mother controls too much of your life? Ethan laughed softly. That is a loaded question. I am serious. His smile faded. She means well. She has always been protective. Protective. The same word Thomas had used. The same justification everyone seemed to offer. Later that night, I sat alone in the living room reviewing the documents again. One detail suddenly stood out. Several references mentioned a private meeting held almost 8 years earlier. The meeting took place before Ethan and I met. Before the fundraiser. Before the carefully arranged introduction. A list of attendees appeared beside the notes. Margaret was there. Thomas was there. Ethan was there. And so was Dr. Rebecca Hayes, the fertility specialist. My pulse quickened. Until that moment, I had assumed the clinic became involved recently. But according to these records, Dr. Hayes had been connected to the plan from the very beginning. The next morning, I requested copies of every document legally available to me from the clinic. I expected resistance. Instead, an administrative assistant accidentally included a reference number that led me to an archived consultation summary. When the file arrived later that afternoon, I opened it immediately. The document described a strategy meeting regarding future family continuity objectives. I read the words twice before turning the page. Then I saw a section labeled Preferred Outcome. Beneath it was a sentence that made my stomach drop. The agreement had never been about preserving a marriage. It had never been about my happiness. According to the original proposal, the marriage itself was considered only a vehicle to achieve the family's long-term objective. And attached to the final page was a note indicating that Margaret had personally approved every stage of the plan. By that point, I no longer doubted that Margaret had orchestrated something far larger than I ever imagined. The question that remained was how much Ethan truly knew. For days I had avoided confronting him directly because I needed facts, not excuses. But every new document pushed me closer to a conversation I could no longer postpone. 2 nights later, Ethan found me sitting alone on the back patio after dinner. The summer air was warm and the neighborhood was quiet. He carried 2 glasses of iced tea and sat beside me. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at me carefully. You have seemed distant lately, he said. Is something wrong? I stared out across the yard. The temptation to reveal everything was overwhelming. Instead, I asked a simple question. Why did you approach me at that fundraiser 8 years ago? Ethan looked surprised. What kind of question is that? Just answer it. He smiled faintly. Because I thought you were interesting. The answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. I turned toward him. Was it really that simple? His expression changed immediately. A brief flicker of uncertainty crossed his face before disappearing. In that moment I knew. He was hiding something. Later that night, after Ethan went upstairs, I opened the archived documents again. One file I had overlooked suddenly caught my attention. It contained notes from a private meeting held 6 months before our wedding. Most of the text was heavily redacted, but one section remained visible. It summarized concerns regarding participant disclosure. Participant. The word made me sick. I was not described as a future spouse. I was described as a participant. Then I noticed a handwritten note attached to the margin. If disclosure becomes necessary, Ethan will handle communication personally. My pulse quickened. I enlarged the scanned image. The handwriting belonged to Margaret. The next morning I made a decision. Instead of confronting Ethan with accusations, I would give him an opportunity to tell the truth voluntarily. That evening I invited him to dinner at a small restaurant overlooking Lake Michigan. It was the same restaurant where he had proposed years earlier. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Throughout the meal, he seemed relaxed, comfortable, completely unaware of what was coming. Finally, I reached into my purse and placed a copy of the document on the table between us. The color drained from his face almost instantly. He did not touch the paper. He did not ask where I found it. He simply stared at it. How much did you know? I asked quietly. Ethan closed his eyes. For several seconds he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice barely rose above a whisper. Not everything. I felt my heart sink. It was not a denial. Then tell me what you did know. Ethan looked directly at me for the first time that evening. His eyes filled with regret. At the beginning, I agreed to something I never should have agreed to. I froze. The words echoed in my mind. Then he said the sentence I had been dreading for weeks. My mother chose you before I ever met you. The restaurant suddenly felt too small. The sounds of conversation from nearby tables faded into the background as I stared at Ethan across the table. My mind kept replaying his words. My mother chose you before I ever met you. For weeks I had been chasing documents, signatures, and hidden plans. Now, for the first time, someone directly involved was finally speaking. Tell me everything, I said quietly. Ethan lowered his eyes. He looked exhausted, as though he had been carrying a secret for years and no longer had the strength to hold it. When my father became sick, my mother became obsessed with the future, he said. She talked constantly about protecting the family, preserving the name, continuing the legacy. I remained silent. At first I thought it was just talk, he continued. Then she started introducing me to attorneys, consultants, and people who specialized in long-term family planning. The phrase sounded disturbingly familiar. I had already seen it in multiple documents. Ethan rubbed his forehead. When she first mentioned you, I did not even know who you were. My stomach tightened. She already knew everything about me. He nodded slowly, more than I realized at the time. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that mattered most. Did you marry me because your mother told you to? Ethan's face immediately filled with pain. At the beginning, I agreed to meet you because she encouraged it. He paused. But that is not why I married you. I wanted to believe him. Part of me desperately wanted to believe him. But every document I had uncovered stood between us like a wall. Then why did you never tell me? I asked. Ethan looked away toward the dark water beyond the restaurant windows. Because after I got to know you, everything changed. His voice cracked slightly. I fell in love with you, Olivia. The words should have comforted me. Instead, they only created more confusion. Love and deception had become tangled together in ways I could barely understand. Then Ethan said something unexpected. There are things my mother kept from me too. I stared at him. What does that mean? He hesitated before answering. I was never given the complete agreement. My pulse quickened. You signed it. Parts of it. He nodded. Not all of it. The distinction seemed important to him. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded envelope. I recognized Margaret's handwriting immediately. What is that? I asked. Ethan slid it across the table. It arrived at my office 3 days ago. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single handwritten letter from Margaret. The message was brief. If you are reading this, then the truth is finally coming out. There are things neither of you understand about why I made those decisions. At the bottom of the page was an address I had never seen before. Ethan watched my reaction carefully. I went there yesterday, he said quietly. My heart began to race. What did you find? Ethan swallowed hard before answering. The real reason my mother started the entire plan. The next morning, Ethan drove me to the address Margaret had written in her letter. The property sat nearly 2 hours outside Chicago along a quiet country road lined with old oak trees. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary farmhouse. But as we walked toward the front porch, I realized nobody had lived there for years. The paint was faded. The mailbox leaned slightly to one side. Yet the lawn was carefully maintained. Someone had been taking care of the place. Ethan unlocked the front door with a key Margaret had enclosed in the envelope. The moment we stepped inside, I understood why she had sent us there. The walls were covered with photographs. Hundreds of them. Generations of the Carter family. Weddings. Graduations. Birthdays. Family reunions stretching back decades. In the center of the room stood a large wooden table covered with binders and boxes. Margaret was already there waiting for us. For the first time since this nightmare began, she looked tired. Not powerful. Not controlling. Just tired. She motioned for us to sit. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Margaret opened one of the binders. Inside were medical records, letters, and family documents dating back more than 20 years. Slowly, she began explaining. Years ago, after a series of devastating losses within the family, she became consumed by fear. She convinced herself that if she could control the future, she could protect the people she loved. What began as concern gradually became obsession. Every decision became part of a larger plan. Every relationship became something to manage. Every risk became something to eliminate. When Ethan reached adulthood, she started thinking about the future generation of the family. That was when the planning began. The consultants, the attorneys, the agreements, the strategies. Listening to her felt surreal. Nothing she described sounded malicious in her mind. She genuinely believed she was protecting her family. Yet every step she took removed someone else's ability to choose freely. Finally, she looked directly at me. Tears filled her eyes. The greatest mistake of my life was forgetting that people are not plans, she whispered. The room fell silent. Then Margaret slid one final document across the table. It was a legal declaration dissolving every remaining agreement connected to the succession plan. Every phase, every objective, every condition. Gone. Signed. Finalized. She had spent the previous month dismantling the entire structure she spent years creating. Ethan stared at the document in disbelief. I looked at Margaret and saw something I had not expected. Regret. Real regret. Not because her plan had failed, but because she finally understood what it had cost. Later that afternoon, we walked outside together. The sunlight felt different somehow. Lighter. For the first time in weeks, I was no longer chasing clues. The truth was finally complete. Ethan apologized again, not with speeches or promises, but with honesty. Margaret apologized too. Whether forgiveness would happen overnight, I did not know. Some wounds need time. Some truths need space. But one thing had changed forever. My future no longer belonged to a document, an agreement, or someone else's vision of what my life should be. For years, decisions had been made around me. Now they would be made by me. As we drove home, I looked out the window and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Freedom. Not because the past had disappeared, but because it no longer controlled what came next.